Welcome back to this latest episode of Japan's Top Business Interviews. I'm your host, Dr. Greg Story, President of Dale Carnegie Tokyo Training Japan. My special guest today is Yumiko Murakami, who is the General Partner of Empower Partners and a founder also of Empower Partners. Great to have you with me. So, you've had a very prestigious career. I look at your background, it's tremendous, and you've done many interesting things, but this podcast is around leading in Japan. So if we talk about your early experiences of leading in Japan, what things did you find challenging about doing that?
Good question. I don't even know where to start, but I guess I would start, when I came back to Japan after spending, basically almost all my adult life in the United States and some other countries. This was 13 years ago, came back to Japan for the first time as a grown-up. I was born and raised here, but I did my graduate studies in the U.S. and worked there. So when I came back to Japan, it was a very sort of, in many ways, kind of shocking experience in terms of how different things were in Japan versus the countries that I knew pretty well in terms of leadership, in terms of leadership style, in terms of how large corporations and entities, governments, they were run. Just in general, the culture of the Japanese society, especially around leadership, how people lead, how people work together, very different to the extent where I got shocked.
When you were shocked, what things immediately struck you as, oh, wow, this is quite different? What were those things?
One of the most striking differences still is, and was at the time, how much consensus-driven leadership style was still pretty much the mainstream, and I say still is. I think it's probably changing slowly, but I would say if you compare what you would see in many leaders in other countries, especially in the U.S., it's a country that I probably know the best. The consensus-driven, very much actually very inclusive, in a good sense. That approach is very striking in terms of how different many leaders in Japan behave or lead their groups or their peers or companies or whatever entities that they're leading. And like I said, it's actually sometimes a very good thing, but it was very striking in terms of how dominant that sort of consensus-driven leadership style was really everywhere. Pretty much, everywhere you see, every company, every entity I will come across with.
I often say that the decision-making speed, because of that consensus requirement, is quite slow in Japan compared to everywhere else. But then they also say that once the group has made a decision and they're all collectively signed on, there's no saboteurs or resistors, they're all signed on for it. The execution speed is tremendously fast, but they often contrast with Western companies where very fast a decision, but then things sort of don't quite go as smoothly as they should, and people still disagree, they haven't really signed on, and somehow, which is better or which is faster, it depends on how you want to look at it. But apart from that consensus aspect, were there any other things that sort of struck you as like, oh, okay, this is quite different?
So we're talking about here, I guess, leadership and leadership style that, I think unique in Japan or different in Japan. But I think the what I said about this consensus-driven approach, it's not only among leaders or leadership that we're talking about here, but you see that everywhere, every level of any organization. You see that approach in terms of being a part of the consensus building process. That is important, even if you are one of the most junior staff of your organization or your company. Being part of that consensus building process is very, very important for anyone working in Japan. And that's really interesting. So, again, we're talking about leadership here in terms of how the style is different in Japan versus other countries. But whole consensus building is really applied to every level of organization. So that leads to another interesting observation or interesting sort of, I guess, differentiation in this country is that the risk-taking and the sort of responsibility that comes with risk-taking, the whole notion is very different. Because you're part of that whole consensus building process, whether you are the president or you are a manager or you are, a junior staff. When it comes to risk-taking, the appetite of risk-taking becomes very diluted because you are not the driving force of that decision-making process. And as I said, this is not just for leaders, but this applies to everyone. But I do think that kind of has a lot of implications in terms of how leaders behave in this country, in terms of risk-taking appetite, as well as the basic attitude toward risk-taking. And again, that comes with the responsibility of taking any risk, right? And so when we talk about leaders in Japan, one of the things that I would love to see more of is this attitude of leaders taking responsibility or ownership or accountability in terms of taking risk. I mean, when you say take risk, it sounds very ground, and it sounds like you're working for Goldman Sachs, you're setting up a prop desk and trading. It's not that. It's anything that has to do with any new initiative. Hiring somebody, for example, for organization. You take a risk of choosing that person over another candidate or other candidates, and that actually the sense of taking risk and taking responsibility for it, I think is very muted among, again, based on my exposure, my sort of interactions among Japanese leaders. And that is something that I would love to see more of.
So what's driving that, do you think? I mean, everyone should have some clear ideas around due diligence, risk reduction, etc., and scaling the risk. But what do you think is driving that particular Japanese penchant for having really low risk threshold?
Well, I think it's a combination of many things, but clearly one of the probably main reasons as to leaders or people behave in this way is the entire labor market structure, the entire the employment structure in terms of how companies employ, and not only employ, but also how companies manage the employees in terms of their, career track, promotion, compensation. A lot of this has, I think, implications or motivation in terms of how people behave when it comes to risk-taking. So if I look at many large Japanese companies, there is still a very strong sense of avoiding risks, because at the end of the day, you are still in this, I don't want to say permanent, I guess it's a lifetime employment system. It's not really permanent, but it is changing. But if you think about the way people are promoted because of their because of the age, because of how many years they've been with the company. It's a really longevity, right? And it's not because they have taken risks. Obviously, risks, can be very, rewarding, but at the same time, it could really damage your chance of getting promoted or chance of getting, get paid. And I think that the current incentive system based on the current labor market structure in Japan is such that people are in general not encouraged to take risks, and that's a problem.
And you talk about the reward part. I mean, you were working in Wall Street, as I recall, and so your bosses there would have had massive salaries, massive bonuses, massive share options, huge upside for them on taking risks. But if you look at their counterparts in Japan, they only get paid a lot of money. The shacho of a big company doesn't earn that much dough. Share options are not such a big thing here. The upside for them taking risk, and all through, as you say, through the many layers of the companies, the upside of risk taking is relatively minor from a financial sense. But I guess the downside of failure is very, very, very high in terms of you're not going to make it to the next level because someone will remember, Greg made that mistake back in 78 or something, and black mark against his name, so we'll take the other person. So I guess there's a bit of a balance there, isn't there, between, say, particularly the American side, where the salaries are just mind-bogglingly large compared to probably every other country in the world, but particularly in Japan. So there's not much incentive, really, is there, to take a risk?
No, there isn't. That's exactly what I said. It's actually people behaving very rationally. People behaving extremely rationally. If I were one of these executives who are, that there are executives who are at that level company, whether the president or the C-suite, they look at risk, reward sort of balance and say, do I take this risk? Is it worth it? And people don't take these risks, which would come with huge downside possibilities, but very small upside, right? So I think you're right. I think people are behaving very rationally. So do I think the U.S.-style huge compensation for CEOs, do I think that's the right way to approach? I don't necessarily think that's the answer, but I do think in terms of how you incentivize leaders, how you motivate leaders to take risks, not only financial sense, but also the responsibilities and the roles that they play in the organizations. I think there has to be a better incentive / motivation scheme that can give people healthy level of incentives. And I think as long as you make sure that there is a alignment in terms of timeline, as well as multiple stakeholders in terms of what they are asking for. It's not just for employees, shareholders, but there are many other stakeholders. I think there can be a very healthy incentive / motivation scheme that can be introduced in this Japanese environment, and I do think the timeline issue is very critical. I think one of the challenging aspects of the U.S. compensation scheme that I see in Wall Street in particular is a timeline. So what is it? Is it this quarter? Next quarter's earnings? Is this the stock price of this year, this month? Is this something that you are really focused on? And I think that becomes a little bit of a tricky situation. And I think there has to be a much longer term. It should not be a quarter. It should not be a year. It should be, we're talking about 10 years, 20 years, even longer time horizon that has to be taken into consideration when you look at the alignment of incentives given to leaders, given to CEOs and C-suite executives and other stakeholders. So that is something that I think we should be really looking into in the context of Japan. When I say people are behaving very rationally, I don't think people are doing something that's doesn't make sense. It makes a lot of sense for them to behave this way. They're not incentivized to take risks. But if you look at the alignment of long-term benefits of companies that they're leading, and not only companies, but also, like I said, many other stakeholders, I don't think the current risk reward is a very good one for Japan or for Japanese leaders, but also entire Japan.
And this is one of the other things that people often talk about in Japan is the relatively small entrepreneur group in Japan. And this comes back to entrepreneurship by definition. You're an entrepreneur. You've taken a big risk to start this company, to get investors together, to create funds and this type of thing. It is quite, stepping out from the safety of employment. But in that low risk, low tolerance of failure culture, very hard to get people to become entrepreneurs. And if you look at a lot of the advances that we see, particularly in business, they're coming from entrepreneurs, particularly in America, be it Silicon Valley or wherever. And often people talk about, well, Japan really has got to have a better environment to encourage people to be entrepreneurs, take those risks, step up and build the country. So what do you think about that aspect, that maybe part of this is why we're not seeing maybe the bigger pool of entrepreneurship we need to see here?
I agree. The whole notion of low risk tolerance in Japan applies to startup companies as well. The whole ecosystem that needs to be really developed much more than what we have right now. So as I said earlier, company presidents or executives are behaving very rationally when it comes to taking risks, right? Because look at the risk reward and look at incentives. So I don't blame them for not taking risks. And at the same time, I would say I don't blame entrepreneurs in Japan for not taking risks in the same way as their counterparts in Silicon Valley, or there are many other countries that are really strong in entrepreneurship. Israel, for example, other countries in Asia. I don't blame them because the current system, the societal and also economic system that they operating, there is not much of an appetite for anybody. If you look at the downside, and if you look at the upside, and then you're trying to figure out, okay, is it worth to take a risk and take out huge loans from a bank and start a business and the answer tends to be no. As you probably know, that there are many legal and also structural problems when it comes to entrepreneurship, when it comes to starting business in Japan, in terms of personal actually risks, especially if you're starting a business on your own, if you don't have a lot of backup in terms of financial backup, there is still a very big risk that you could really lose your personal assets. Although they're trying to change the legal framework around it. But I can tell you, when my mother started her own business, 30 years ago, I really was worried about my parents losing their home, their house. My father took mortgage out of a bank and built their house, and I actually was really worried about them losing their personal assets because my mother was starting her own business. And again, things are actually getting better, but still there's the huge risk, a personal risk that entrepreneurs would have to take on. So again, when we talk about risk-taking, appetite for risk, again, risk reward, is there a second chance for entrepreneurs who failed with their first trial? Is there a second chance or third chance or fourth chance? It's really hard for these entrepreneurs to see how they can pick up themselves and start the second one, the third one, the fourth one in the current environment. So going back to the notion of risk-taking and risk appetite, I think that people are behaving very rationally in the Japanese context, given the current environment. Why am I a VC then? Why am I an investor? I do think that things are actually changing. Like I said, there is a lot. You probably know the Japanese government is really pushing very, very aggressively the startup initiatives that they're implementing right now under the new administration. And I think there is a very keen sense of crisis among many leaders in Japan, not only in politics, but also in business, that the engine of the Japanese economy really should be startups. Not that I think large companies are dead, they are important. But when it comes to innovation, when it comes to creating new businesses, new industry, the role of startups and role of entrepreneurs is critical. And without healthy ecosystem of startups, I don't see much of an upside in terms of where Japan is going. And like I said, that's the common sort of sense of crisis that I think a lot of leaders are really starting to feel. And therefore, I see very, very aggressive, I don't want to say aggressive, very proactive initiatives being taken by the government and also by the private sector leaders. And I think this is a really exciting time for me as a new venture capitalist who can provide capital, risk money to entrepreneurs. If you look at the macro picture, Japan has tremendous potential. If you look at the technologies that this economy actually have developed in so many different industries, if you look at people, if you look at the education that Japanese people have been receiving, it's tremendous. The talent pool is tremendous. In terms of capital, in terms of money, there is a lot of money. There is not much risk money, but money is here. And so if you look at the basic ingredients that you would love to have if you were to create this new startup ecosystem in any country, any society, Japan has all these great things, right? So it's a matter of connecting. It's a matter of connecting dots. I think that all the dots that we want to see, we have here. So I just feel as if Japan is actually reaching a point where there is enough sense of crisis among leaders, and I do think things are starting to move quickly. And I'm very excited to be part of that whole movement that I think it is picking up a lot of momentum.
If you want to be successful as a leader, do the Leadership Training for Managers course. All companies need people who can both manage and lead. Leading people screams out for real skills in communication, dealing with all different types of people, being excellent at innovation, planning, delegation, handling mistakes, doing performance reviews really well, and inspiring and motivating the team. Do the Leadership Training for Managers course now in either Japanese or English. Are you doing business with Japan? Do you really know how things work? Japan Business Mastery provides the answers. Do you have the right networks and know how to create them? Do you know how to get on the same wavelength with Japanese buyers? Do you know what being trustworthy looks like from the Japanese perspective? Japan Business Mastery is based on more than 30 years' experience in Japan and will become your go-to guide. Want to succeed in Japan? Buy Japan Business Mastery now. Well, you are certainly a pathfinder in what you're doing. And as you mentioned before, in America, if someone's failed a couple of times in their businesses, it's seen as a mark of respect, and you've got experience and you learned the hard way. And a lot of times you hear venture capitalists say, I'd rather put my money on the fourth try than the first try because I know they've learned so much on the first three. But I think in Japan, in a lot of ways, the stigma of failure is very high. And if you fail, well, then you're out. It's very hard to make a comeback. But when you started this business, you had to staff the business. You lead this business. You've got to convince people to quit what they're doing, which is probably maybe more secure than what they're doing now. It's a new startup. So what struggles did you find to actually convince people? Because often with a lot of companies, when I talk about this question, they say, well, look, their grandparents were against it, or their parents were against it, or in the case of men, it's often the case their wife was against it, and they don't want to make that change. They don't want to join that company. And so it's very hard, actually, when you're a startup, to actually get people to come and join you. Certainly, we started up in 2007. It was a nightmare to try and get people to join us who didn't know about us. It was very difficult. What sort of things have you found in that sense, from the micro point of view?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited, because a lot of really amazingly talented young people are very eager to join, if they're not starting their own startups, join startups. And this is something that is relatively new in Japan. If you are in the United States, if you look at the last, say, 10 years, 15 years, you go to top universities to recruit. As a very large company, for example, Goldman Sachs, I was part of the recruiting team. I would go to Harvard Business School to recruit. And we didn't have a lot of problems getting good students in the
We're
past.
from Goldman Sachs. Please come and join us. It's not a hard one, is it?
So when I graduated from Harvard Business School in '94, Goldman and McKinsey of the world, they would come to campus for recruiting events, and I went along with gazillions of other students, and it was definitely, Goldman was one of the most popular employers for Harvard Business School graduates, and it still is very popular. And I must say, back in the day, again, this is 25 years ago, I didn't really have a lot of my classmates saying, "Oh, I'm going to start a new business," or "I'm going to join a 10 people company somewhere in Silicon Valley." Really, things started to change around 2000. Certainly in the last 10 years. When you'd be surprised, because I as a part of Goldman Sachs recruiting team, I would go to Stanford and Harvard, those schools for recruiting events, and you just really started to see a clear shift among those students, top students, in terms of what they're interested in. Many people are no longer interested in joining established large corporations. A lot of them are really interested in really entrepreneur type of environments, whether again, starting their own business or joining small new companies. Now, as you probably know, in Silicon Valley, Stanford graduates, almost all of them would join startup companies versus large companies. So that is starting to happen in Japan. It's new. And what I find when I started my own fund a little over a year ago, with two partners, I was very surprised to receive very, very passionate inquiries and from young people who are very interested in working in startups, VCs, and these people are young, they're smart and driven, and I just felt as if this is what I saw when I was recruiting, when I was visiting top universities in America for recruiting events, and started to see sort of a shift in the mindset of these students. Again, this was 10, 15 years ago in the US, even longer. And I just felt as if, oh, this is déjà vu. I saw this in the United States, and how the appetite, the sort of mindset was changing among students. And if this is what is happening in Japan now with younger, I don't see that with older professionals, not that much. But in terms of younger generation, people are in the 20s, people are graduating from college or working, but a couple years out of college in the 20s. If that's what we're seeing now with these young people, we've got a pretty bright future. So I say it's still the beginning. I don't think this is categorized as mainstream. As I said earlier in the beginning, one of the challenges that we have to address is this very rigid labor market in Japan. If you look at the mobility of the Japanese labor market, still very, very low. People don't move around. People don't change their companies. partially because of that risk, appetite that we discussed, partially because there isn't much of flexibility. There aren't that many possibilities for people to do different things. But I do think young people are changing that. And even if large companies are slow to change the way they recruit and the way they manage their employees, they promote and compensate. If you look at the dynamics of supply-demand in the labor market, who has bargaining power? The young people. We don't have a lot of young people, right? We have a lot of old people. We don't have young people. And if you look at the sort of bargaining power, clearly young people would have much more bargaining power than older people if you look at this equation of power balance. And that's exciting because these young people who's got a lot of bargaining power, who's got a lot of, basically, power, they're basically saying, we're not interested in these established large companies who would maybe give us, very sort of secure career path for the next 30 years, but we're not interested. That's what, as Goldman Sachs, that's what we kind of face in the United States, right? So Goldman Sachs would have to be very competitive. They would have to come up with a really, really attractive package. I'm not talking about just money, but in terms of career options. If you join Goldman Sachs versus, whatever company that may be looking at, a Silicon Valley startup company, what would make Goldman Sachs offer more attractive, right? And again, compensation is one of the factors, but I don't think it's the main factor. It is the possibility. It is a possibility that that young person who is very driven, who is very, very, hungry, if that person can see themselves, herself or himself, becoming a leader who can make a difference, who can make a huge impact in whatever role, whatever company that they work in. I think that is going to be an interesting proposition. And I don't know whether Japanese companies get that. And I just hope they will, because they are losing. This is a war of talent, right? This war of talent has been going on for a long time, especially when it comes to, digital savvy, young talent. This huge, war going on to get those people. And I think those people are not interested in working for these large companies.
So the question comes down to, like, as you say, we see this shift. People are thinking differently about work. Well, your company is, at this point, is a startup company, it's a small company. So you have to get people who say, I don't want to work for the big mega corporation, but I'm not going to do a startup, but I want to do something else. Because there's the rub, isn't it? If the startup culture is so attractive, they don't want to work for us either. These sort of medium-sized companies, small companies, I don't want to work there. I don't work for the big company, I don't want to work for the small company, I want to work for myself. So we, in terms of recruiting people for our own companies, have to find those people who are not for the big ones, but don't want to be a startup, but are prepared to do something else. Mm-hmm. So that's going to be the tricky thing, particularly as you say. I've been recruiting in Japan since 1992, and I can see the difference of how many resumes I used to get. And then about 10 years ago, the number of resumes started to come down. About 5 years ago, I noticed that the power balance that you mentioned started to switch, and they were interviewing me. I wasn't interviewing them. And this whole thing about, it's not just remuneration, it's around the culture of your company, the values of your company, the why of your company, the prospect of your company of doing something important. All of those things started to change, and so we are still trying to recruit people today, but it's much, much harder. There's fewer of them. Competition is much stiffer because the Japanese companies who are dormant have, because of the shrinking population, gone overseas. And so they've got empires outside of Japan in a business sense, and they want people who are going to work in those businesses. So they're looking for the same sorts of people we're looking for. So again, that competition for talent has become even more intense. But in terms of engaging people around their work or getting people to think about being innovative around their work, I mean, you've been running, I know, only for about, what was it, May last year, I think you kicked off
We
the
launched
fund?
the fund, yeah, May.
In May, right? So it has been over a year. So in terms of keeping people and retaining people is certainly, I think, one of the big factors of leadership now, because you can rehire them, but boy, after you've trained them, got them on board, keeping them and not losing them, that's a really important aspect. So what have you found works in terms of engaging and keeping people motivated, getting them feeling they've got some ownership of the direction of the company, they're thinking about how we can make the company better, they're signing on for that. What things have you found have been working for you?
I guess it depends on the person, depends on the company in terms of what might work. For me personally, I think what is working, and this is really important for me, is the fact that I am taking myself, or just basically because I started this fund, it doesn't mean that I know more. I am more senior in terms of experience or anything like that when it comes to VC. So I haven't taken this approach that I'm learning from them. I'm actually learning from them as much as they may be learning from me, or they may be learning from their work. And I think that's working, at least for me, really well, because that's the fact. I feel as if I'm dealing with very young people. I mean, young, like my kids' generation, right? And when it comes to investment, because all these entrepreneurs are very young, and there are, a lot of them are 20-something and 30-something. I have an 18-year-old kid, who's studying college, and, quite frankly, and it was some of the team members, some of the funds members, I was talking to them and realized I'm same age with their mothers. So what's working for me is the fact that, I'm learning. It is actually true. I'm learning from them in the same way as they're learning, hopefully from me, but not just from me, but also from other members, and also from sort of day-to-day work experience. And I think it's very true for smaller companies. Especially if you're, like in my case, we're doing something new. It's a new company that we are just launching, and I think that the sense of fair sort of a partnership, I think is a very good one. It's a very good one for me, and also it's a very good one, hopefully, for our team members as well. They have a fair chance of voicing their views when it comes to important decision-making process. We actually do have a very open sort of system whereby, we don't have a hierarchy in terms of what people can say or can propose or anything like that. And again, it's a small team, so when we have 10 people, maybe it's a little easier to do it, and maybe it gets a little trickier when you have 100 people. But in our case, because it's a smaller team and because it's a new business, and new business not only for other people but founders, there's a new business, I think it's relatively easy for us to establish that fair sense of everyone's role in the whole decision-making process. And I think that's hopefully attractive. I mean, we'll see. It's been only a year and 3 months and 4 months. So far, it's been working really well.
That's good. And I guess building a culture is critical. I mean, for a lot of companies, they have an existing corporate culture from headquarters, and then you have the Japan version of that culture locally, and then you have your division version of that culture and your section version of that culture. So creating culture is one of the critical things, I think, as a glue for keeping people with the company. Because I know I've had my own team tell me, look, I've been made offers because there's an absolute army of recruiters out there trying to move people around. and they get offers from other companies who pay more than we do. But the thing that keeps them with us is the culture. It's the attractiveness of a certain working environment where you're going to be looked after financially, but you're not going to have a lot of politics and a lot of stress and a lot of problems you'll get in another company. So the money's not worth it from their point of view. It's rather have the prospect of making money here in a more pleasant environment. So what about culture? Like when you start the business from zero, right? What were your thoughts about, okay, what sort of culture are we going to have here? What sort of culture are we going to build here? How will we build this culture? And how will we maintain this culture once we start? What were your sort of thoughts around that area?
You know, it's interesting how three founders, we
So
came.
your three founders are, there's yourself, there's...
There are three of us. Kathy Matsui, who was vice chair of Goldman Sachs Japan until the end of 2020.
Right.
She and I actually joined Goldman Sachs in the same year, 1994, so we worked together for a long time. And then we have Seki Miwa, who was actually a year ahead of me at Harvard Business School. So I met her at business school 20-some years ago. So again, I've known her for almost 30 years. She joined Morgan Stanley after business school, and then she became a portfolio manager of a U.S. asset management company. She was running their Tokyo office. So she has investor experience, got a very good track record. She recently has been publishing quite a few books as a translator. So she, if you look at the bestseller list of business books in Japan, I would say half of them are translated by
Really?
Miwa. I think she started as a hobby.
She's a busy woman.
Yeah, so she started as a hobby because she just thought, some of these amazing books that she read in English, original, were really not translated very well in Japan. So she said, oh, maybe I can do this. And she did it really, really well. So she translated books like Factfulness, there are, 0 to 1 and many of these really well respected business books, English books. She translated them. So that's what she's been doing for the last, several years.
So the three of you are a well-constructed group of long-term trust, friendship, experience, shared values, no doubt. So as you start the company, you've got to think, okay, well, the people who work for us weren't at Harvard with us, or they weren't working in Wall Street with us necessarily. As you say, younger generation. So again, what did you think about that culture creation? What were things that you thought, okay, how are we going to actually structure this for the long term?
So we wanted to make sure that we have, we nurture this sense of inclusiveness. And we have been, three of us, have been always minorities all our lives. Me as a Japanese female working on Wall Street, like there was no one else like that. Same as Kathy. Kathy is female American working in Japan. Miwa also worked, Miwa is Japanese, worked in the US, also in Japan. Even when I came back to Japan, I just realized, I'm still a minority. There aren't that many women working, at senior levels in Japan. So we know, firsthand what it's like to be a minority. And we know how hard it is. And we also know that because we are different, we know that we can actually offer very interesting perspectives and a lot of things that perhaps many people don't see very clearly. So we wanted to make sure that what we have experienced can really come through as advantage for our fund. We're different. We've been very different, and we've been different. That's why we were able to see certain things that were not obvious to others, and that's really wanted to be a big part of the culture. We wanted to be inclusive of all sorts of different types of people. And I think one thing we need to be very careful is that because we're women, we don't want to give an impression that we don't hire men. Because some people ask, do you hire men? And of course, we want to hire men, and we have hired men. in a team as well. But what's really important for us in terms of building a culture, our own sort of developing our own culture, is to make sure that we respect and sometimes could be very kind of strange, just kind of unique perspectives, and that's something that we really wanted to instill in our fund, being very open-minded, very inclusive, very sensitive to different types of people. So, and I want that to be, main part of the culture of a fund, but also I want that to be something that a lot of our portfolio companies would embrace, because I do think that becomes a competitive advantage. And people don't think about that. It becomes a huge competitive advantage to be able to think outside the box. When you have 10 people who've got the same backgrounds, chances are you're going to say 1 + 1 is 2.
Yeah.
When you have somebody who come from Mars, that person might say, wait a minute, it can't be 4, right? And I think that's the kind of, environment that we want to create in any innovative, companies or, startups. And so we want to do that ourselves. And, I know we're not perfect. I know we have a lot more to do to make sure that becomes a very strong, core of the culture that we have for our fund. But like I said, if we are successful, we can be very different. We can be unique, and hopefully that can give us competitive advantage in the business setting. Again, same thing for our portfolio companies.
Nice. And if you're going to give some advice to someone who's being sent to Japan to run the organization, what would be some advice you'd give them to be successful in Japan?
I think that I have seen many executives, many non-Japanese executives working. Well, actually, I was probably seen as one of them because I was transferred from Goldman Sachs New York office to the Tokyo office. It was a kind of interesting situation because I'm Japanese. I speak fluent Japanese, and I look Japanese. But I was hired in the United States, and I was promoted to an MD in America. So I came to Japan as a Japanese executive, but came from a New York office. And I think one of the things that I saw with my colleagues who were also getting transferred to Japan from the U.S. And myself is that there is this a notion that dealing with Japanese people, there's a notion, there's a little bit of not fear, but a little bit of a notion that Western culture or Western value system is so different from that of Japan that it's going to be difficult. And I think there's some truth in it, but believe it or not, I think it's a lot more individual than the country. And I think that's really important for people, Western people who come to Japan to realize it's very individual in terms of how the value system is perceived, how value system, the value set of values that he or she will bring to the leadership role will come across is very individual. So you think, oh, I'm an American executive. I felt the same way. This is how things are done. This is how things are run. This is how things are, led. People are led, and based on my experience in the United States, this is how maybe I should conduct myself in a leadership position. I would imagine these people executives, so they have leadership positions. But I think you got to just make sure that a lot of successful leaders, executives that I have seen, Western executives, have taken an approach that it's much more than Western versus Eastern, Western versus Japan. I think it's really, at the end of the day, individual value system that will come through more strongly than the cultural, societal differences or cultural differences that would drive these differences. So I think that what's important is for somebody who's new to Japan, in the Japanese in the society, I think it's important that he or she would have to ask themselves, what is it that's important to me, not as an American, but as a person? I think that's probably a very important question to ask themselves. And what is important about me as a person, and how do I want to construct my relationships with new colleagues in Japan, and just set aside the cultural or country or cultural differences, and just as a person. I think that's kind of important. That's what I see with the very successful executives that I have seen, Western executives, or executives who actually have done really well in the Japanese context.
And I guess, when you were sent from New York to the Tokyo office, right, your bosses back in New York probably had some expectations about what you would do in Japan and what you'd produce in Japan. So often when people are sent as the CEO or the MD or the president of the operation in Japan, they're coming with expectations from headquarters about the speed. We talked about that before, which things are going to be happening and the sort of size of the results they're going to have to get, et cetera, et cetera. So just a counterpoint to that idea you had before around about, okay, so be yourself, your own value system. It's not being American, it's being you. That's all around you. But then you've got this sort of headquarter pressure to get things rolling. So what about that? How do they balance that part out? Because that doesn't go away. So I'm just going to be me. In Japan, the headquarters might say, well, no, you're going to be what we want you to be in Japan.
I think it's a really tough one, because I know that happens a lot. But I think, quite frankly, when the new assignment is given to you in terms of running a new business in Japan, and you are based in whatever in America, you're coming to the new country, I think that's the discussion you, as a person taking up this new responsibility, to have with your boss in America. And quite frankly, if you don't have that discussion, okay, what is it that is expected of me, right? And if it's something that, as a person, as a leader, it's something that I feel very comfortable doing, then that's great. But if, as a person, are you going to be a total, a jerk and just run a Japanese organization in a way, Western American way, and, basically, upsetting, all your colleagues? Do you think that's going to lead to a success? Probably not. And is this something that, as a person, as a leader, is this really something that you feel comfortable with? And I don't think maybe people don't have that luxury to have that discussion with their bosses, right? I mean, it would be great if you had that. If you have that luxury of having that heart-to-heart talk, giving a very different cultural environment that you are going to be operating in. That's great. But I do think you owe to yourself to at least try to have that conversation. Otherwise, I said I've seen a lot of successful executives, but I also have seen many failed Western executives. And that's tough. Really tough. I feel for them.
Yeah. I guess one of those things of you don't know what you don't know. And so to have that contextual conversation with your boss before you come here without really knowing Japan, quite difficult, isn't it? Because your boss may have expectations about Japan which are not rooted in reality or any real cogent experience, but they're still directing you. And I had that experience of my bosses in Hong Kong. And somehow being in Hong Kong gave him some magical knowledge about Japan, which was not the facts. So there was always this tension between the reality I was facing and what he thought we should be doing in Japan, which again, not rooted in anything factual reality. So it was always that tension.
Well, that's where you come in, right? You actually is the person who can just say, hey, maybe something that you want to do a little homework on, and you would probably be able to help these people.
Yeah, well, that's why I left corporate life and work for myself as an entrepreneur now. So thinking about a discussion about leading in Japan and your rich experience of being here, leading, anything we haven't covered so far that we should talk about? We haven't really talked about women in leadership position in Japan. You've sort of touched on a little bit in terms of being a minority. But also, we all know the numbers. There are very few women leaders. You see it you see the photograph of the new cabinet. Hard to spot the women. You look at the numbers about the number of women who are becoming the leaders, and most of the women presidents in Japan are the widows of founder husbands who passed on. And so, it's a very small group anyway, and within that group, it's a specialised group. But any advice you'd have for, because a lot of women listen to this podcast too, for their careers and being a successful leader in Japan, any advice for them?
I think that, as I said earlier, there's a shift of power to younger generation, right, in Japan. A shift of power to women as well. Because I do believe that this very tight labor market in the Japanese society makes it harder for companies to hire anyone good, anybody really, really good. Companies in Japan have long basically lost, they really didn't see this opportunity of tapping this talent pool women, right? And now they're starting to wake up. Oh, actually, if you look at, for example, I work for OECD, if you look at the stats from OECD, data from OECD, Japanese women are better skilled than any other woman, any other population, female populations in any other countries, right? So it is just incredible. It's a low-hanging fruit for Japanese corporations to look at the female talent pool, but they didn't for a long time. They're starting to realize, oh, this is bad because we can't hire men and women, right? On top of that, this is, again, if there are Western executives listening to this talk, this is a secret weapon. Female professionals, female Japanese women are secret weapon because for a long time, it's been a secret weapon for Western companies because Western companies tend to be a little bit, I don't want to say perfectly, but they are a lot more open-minded when it comes to hiring female professionals compared to their counterparts in Japan. So when Japanese companies are completely blinded and not looking at this female talent pool and just looking at all the men who work for them, there is incredible opportunities for Western companies to find amazing, talented Japanese women, right? So that's why they're called secret weapon for Western companies. Now, as I said before, on back of this very tight labor market, supply and demand, I think Japanese companies are starting to wake up very slowly. What that means is there is a shift of power to women, especially highly educated young women. And so again, if you are listening as a Japanese, young woman, this is a really, really interesting time. I wish I were 24 again. When I was graduating from college, there were no opportunities. I mean, women were not even hired for professional positions by anybody, except for a very small number of Western companies. So that's why I left Japan. I went to the US. If I were, 24, opportunities are 10 times, 100 times. And I want Western companies to continue to hire, continue to look for talent in the female talent pool, because, again, it's still a secret weapon to some extent. At the same time, slowly, Japanese companies are waking up. So I think it's a really tremendously interesting time for young Japanese women. So Western company executives, make sure you look for female talent because, again, still a secret weapon. Young women, this is a great time to be 20-something in Japan.
Starting your careers,
Awesome time.
So if you're going to give a definition of leadership, what would it be?
Again, I don't know if there is one that I can say this is a definition, because I do think going back to my earlier comment, you got to really ask yourself, what is it that makes you feel very proud of yourself, leading people, leading organization? And it can be different things. For me, leadership is something that is not something that would demonstrate by the title. I think it's something that you actually demonstrate by action. And I'm a little bit shy about, doing this. Just basically, I'm a leader, follow me. I maybe I'm not comfortable doing that because I don't feel as if that would be convincing enough for my colleagues to follow me just by saying, I am the president, I am the founder of this company, follow me. And I just feel as if there would be a better team, there would be better a culture if I could say, let's move together. I am going to move this direction and please come with me. And quite frankly, I will be learning from you in terms of how to get to point B from point A. Hopefully you will learn a few things from me at the same time. For me, that would be a much better leadership style. Again, it depends on the person and there is no one right answer. But for me, that works better.
Wonderful. Great place to finish. Thank you very much, Yumiko. It's been fantastic. Really appreciate you sharing your views with me today. And please join us again for our next episode of Japan's top business interviews.